Welcome to Read, the research, education, and advocacy podcast, where we connect you with researchers, educators, and thought leaders on topics in child development and education. I'm your host, Danielle Gomez, and I am joined by an expert in reading comprehension, spanning from translation and implementation science to what are those evidence-based practices, interventions, and assessments in reading comprehension. And I know all of our readers are just loving everything that we're talking about with reading comprehension. So I'd like to introduce my guest, Dr. Amy Elleman. Dr. Elleman, welcome to the Read podcast.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I love how already I'm like, we've been doing the podcast for 4 years, and I was talking to you, Amy, before, and I had to record my intro like 4 times, but we're good to go. So I guess my question for you first is, how are you and where are you showing up in the world today?
Well, it's great to be here, and it's getting busy. Holidays are coming, so thinking about what's on the menu for Thanksgiving. Right now, I've got to put that together. My daughter just came in from New York, so I'm very excited about that, and she's already got half of the menu taken care of. So I'm looking forward to that.
All right, so Thanksgiving, my husband and I go back and forth. I'm going to say that Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday. So what is the favorite Thanksgiving side dish that you like? Or maybe you're a turkey person. I don't know.
Actually, half of us are vegetarian, pescatarian.
Okay.
So we do turkey, and so I will have one bite of turkey just because it is Thanksgiving. But I am a sides person. I always have been. So I like all of the sides. But you know what I really love?
What?
Pie.
Oh,
so it's all about the pie for us.
Yeah.
We're trying to narrow down because there are only 4 of us this year. We're only allowing 4 different pies. So this is going to be difficult.
Oh my gosh. One for each person, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
We should all have a choice, right?
Yeah.
We're probably going to have to do tartlets though, I think.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that sounds so good. Well, I think mine is, I go back and forth. Sometimes it's a sweet potato pie. This year we're making some really fun, like vegetable dishes, actually some Brussels sprouts and bacon, a gratin. And then my younger sister and I are both Swifties, so we're making chai tea cookies. So we'll see how those turn out. But of course, pie is great. So, oh, yes, I'm so excited. And I also know that you and I are joining for tea. Dr. Cabell and I last month had tea time, and now I'm so excited to have tea with Dr. Elleman. Thank you so much. And, I think it's just very festive. I have a nice cinnamon tea this morning with my Windward mug. So before we get into our own Thanksgiving meal, I do have to introduce our Read listeners to Dr. Elleman officially, for those of you who don't know all the work that you've been doing. So Dr. Amy Elleman currently serves as the director of the Middle Tennessee State University Literacy Studies PhD program, an interdisciplinary program dedicated to teaching doctoral students how to translate literacy research to practice. Dr. Elleman has experience as a teacher and administrator serving students with learning and behavior difficulties. Dr. Elleman earned a BS or Bachelor in Science in Psychology at the University of Maryland in Heidelberg, Germany. She earned her MED and PhD at Vanderbilt University, where she became interested in the early identification and treatment of reading comprehension difficulties. Her current research includes investigating individual differences in vocabulary acquisition for students with learning difficulties, conducting meta-analysis focused on comprehension, which I'm so excited to talk about those, and examining the impact of knowledge and inference instruction for students with reading comprehension difficulties, which are hot topics for this conversation. So much to dive into. I'd like to know first, Dr. Elleman, Amy, can you please tell us your story, your journey throughout your professional career?
Sure. And you mentioned that I started off in Germany. My husband was in the military. Mm-hmm. So while I was getting my undergrad degree in psychology, I decided to get a job during the day. And I was lucky enough to get a position with the Department of Defense Schools as an instructional special ed aide. So went into schools, and it was great because all of the things I was learning in psychology, I'm like, wait a second, this is the perfect place to be able to use these techniques, right? So, and I really fell in love with the kids. I was like, okay, this is probably what I need to be doing. But I finished up I got to work. It was amazing. So at the time, 1 out of 800 people who apply for a position in Department of Defense schools get that position. They're highly sought after. So it's just like being with the best of the best for 2 years. So a lot of the techniques that I learned from those teachers, I still use today with my PhD students, which is kind of crazy, but they were excellent. So I learned a lot. We came back to the States, and I got a position as a 7th grade middle school teacher and a special educator. So I had the students with learning disabilities, and half of the time was inclusion, half of the time was self-contained. And that's where I met a great guy named Clifton. And Clifton truly had the voice of an angel, just a wonderful human being. And Clifton could only read his name at this point. He was in 7th grade when he came to me. And what I realized is I didn't know how to help Clifton. I didn't expect to have someone in 7th grade. I knew, I didn't expect it, and I didn't know what to do. So I spent, and this was way back in the day, so I spent a lot of time at the parent-teacher store and at the library, going through a lot of resources and trying to figure out, well, what should I be doing? And it became apparent that I should be, and this was during this was the height of whole language. So I didn't have as much information on phonics that I needed, but from the research I was seeing, I was like, systematic explicit phonics is what this child needs. And of course, everyone was telling me, no, he's too old for phonics at this point. And I'm like, well, but everything I'm reading, this looks like the right way to go. So I start creating materials, using materials from the parent-teacher store. I started to see some progress. So Clifton probably ended up at the end of a 1st grade level by his 7th grade year. So we, made progress, but what would have happened if I had been trained appropriately going in? Like Clifton wouldn't have, he would have left at a much higher level than what I was able to give him. After that, we moved to Nashville, excuse me, and I got a position at a school for students who were zero tolerance out of their home school of zone. So this was through a mental health agency. And I had the oppositional defiant classroom. That's how it was defined. I was hoping for the ADHD classroom, but I didn't get that. Yeah. So I was with kids who, maybe didn't want to learn when they came in every morning. And we worked on them. But what I found there was also a range of kids. And I knew how to take care of, there were probably 2 out of the 12 kids that had those decoding issues. And I knew how to deal with that at this point. But for comprehension, I had no idea. My strategy was to tell the kids, just read it again, because I really couldn't see, because comprehension is not something that, I struggle with often, or unless I'm in really complex text, I'm not struggling with it. And so I didn't understand. I didn't know why they were having problems and what I could really do about it. So it really was, my strategy was, well, just read it again, and then I give them the answer. And so, I realized I needed to go back to school and learn again. So I went back and did my master's and my PhD. Well, I was in my master's, and I was so excited about research, because I'm like, oh, I'm finally getting some of the answers that I've been looking for so long, that I said, I've got to go on. I've got to get the PhD. I spent time doing that after that. And ever since, I have spent my time trying to crack this nut of comprehension and trying to figure out what are the best strategies we can give teachers to help kids. So I'm really dedicated to research to practice, and that's why I love my position, that we are a PhD program. We teach students how to do good research, but we really emphasize that translational piece of research to practice.
Oh, there's so many pieces of that I want to touch upon. I feel like I am at your Thanksgiving table. Like, it's so interesting to learn your story. And the things that I noticed that I really wanted to touch on was, again, from your experience from the DoD, from Department of Education schools, to Clifton, to the students who perhaps were in a school that, this is their last shot, right?
Well,
but would it be like there? I mean, these are students who, at their other schools, like didn't get the services that they needed. And so here they are in this classroom with you. Would you characterize it like that?
absolutely. And so
Yes.
they're dealing with all of these behavior pieces. And then on top of this, and of course, this is years of, them dealing with the behavior pieces, and then they're missing out on so much instruction. But there was a lot of other things going on too, that they weren't exposed to the same background knowledge that other kids were. They didn't, they didn't have the same skills, either from education or experiences in life, to help them understand the text they were reading.
Yeah, I like how you brought that in, because I think as I was talking about last shot, I thought about the systems, right? And thinking from a broader level. I tend to think at an ecological level. So even just thinking about that child, there were, thinking of statistics of school to prison pipelines to students that unfortunately don't matriculate through high school because of different services that were provided to them. And then when you brought in the mental health framework, I think is very interesting too, that when you look at the children that you were working with, the behavioral, the mental health pieces, the background knowledge, and then, of course, the reading comprehension piece, right? And I found it fascinating that you talked a little bit about the decoding piece, but then there was greater comprehension needs that was limiting them from truly accessing the academic curriculum there. And so I like how you drew that through line. What I also really liked is that you have this through line of curiosity, right? That you conducted almost this, maybe intuitively or not, this needs assessment of like, oh my gosh, like there's a problem in my classroom. These are the needs that are happening. I'm going to pursue my PhD program to learn about this more. So I really like those pieces. So going back to that classroom where you looked at their students and you thought to yourself, there's so many reading comprehension needs. I'm sure at the time, and I don't know if I even still can define this, you perhaps were thinking about, okay, they need reading comprehension support, but what is reading comprehension? And so now, as you're sitting here as an expert, how would you define reading comprehension as someone who's been so immersed in it and someone who's taught reading comprehension to readers?
Right. And I don't know that this is the best definition, but it's the one I like the most, and it's used quite often, which was developed by the RAND group in the early 2000s. But I really think reading comprehension is this process of simultaneously extracting and constructing meaning through the interaction and involvement with the written language. So that extracting piece, but also that constructing piece is part of it. So it's not just what's on the page and understanding what's on the page. It's bringing what you know to the page and the author's message that gets you to comprehension. And that interaction is what makes it so complicated.
Yeah, I love that. I'm very, side note, interested in paradox, this idea of two seemingly opposite things that cause a seemingly attention, right? But then actually are constructing something new that you can integrate both, right? And when you think of extraction and construction, two-dimensionally, they seem like opposites, right? But in fact, as you look at reading comprehension, there's this co-integration that of, it mutual phenomenon happening at the same time in processes. And so I love how you started with that definition, and we'll have the RAND on the Read Podcast website. But now let's think beyond 2D in this definition to the frameworks, right? And what I love about the research community is that you all are so invested in creating frameworks that are beyond the 2D model of what we think of as reading comprehension. And so what are you seeing in the research community, and what perhaps are the connection points for some of these research frameworks that are so applicable for teachers?
So, and there are a lot of different frameworks out there and ways of thinking. And I kind of classify these typically in two different groups, one being component models and one being process models. So process models, are what the one that most of us follow in comprehension is construction integration, which goes so well with the definition that that extracting and constructing piece. but really there are these multiple levels that, comprehension's occurring at, and you're extracting and constructing, but you're doing it iteratively over time. So it's like every new idea that's coming in has to be processed, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that interaction. So I like thinking about the process, which is complicated in itself, but I also like some of the component models because it helps us to know where problems may be happening and to be able to identify those, especially as educators. I really like Young-Suk Kim's model. It's the DEAR model, the direct and indirect effects model of reading. And she has this great visual that goes with this. And it's a little building with 2 columns. And, when we think of the simple view, and I think most of your listeners are probably know about the simple view at this point, but we've got word reading on one side. We've got listening comprehension on the other side, or language on the other side. And these pillars, both pillars, are necessary to keep this structure up. Without one or the other, you're dead in the water, right? But what I really like about her visual display and her thinking about this, and she's actually tested these models. So it's not just her thinking up these models. She's actually tested kids and then tested these models to see if they hold up. And she's got this great foundation piece that is under the structure. And on one side, she's got the emergent literacy skills that we all know about: phonology, morphology, orthography. And then on the other side, she's got those higher order cognition skills and self-regulation skills right there under listening comprehension, which actually all of these things are needed for both word reading and listening comprehension. And those foundational language skills, vocabulary, grammar. And under that foundation, she's got an even, another layer where she's talking about these cognitive skills. So these domain general cognitive skills are executive functions that we know are so important, like working memory, what we call inhibitory control, and attentional control. All of those are going to be important for those skills as well. So it, becomes very complicated because any of those things being, having an issue, if a child has an issue in any of those areas, it's going to show up. And your building is not going to be, fully upright. So I like that. I like that model. And then I go back to the RAND again, this interaction between the text, the activity, and the reader, all happening in this sociocultural context. I think that it's a great way to plan instruction when we're thinking about comprehension. If we think about each of these areas and then we plan accordingly with what we know about the reader, what we know we should be doing with the text based on the reader's ability, and then what activities that we have, that all of those things, if we're planning those, then we should get, a better outcome. So I think it helps us to, the DEAR model helps us to identify where all the issues, where they could happen. But I think the RAND model helps us to plan instruction well based on that.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing all those models. I think they draw a depiction of how complex reading is. I liked how you talked about process and this multi-component interaction. I want to draw on the DEAR model later, perhaps when we talk about struggling readers. And I think that that's something that I love learning about from you in terms of what happens when students struggle. But let's continue with the RAND. I think what you talked about with the RAND in terms of evidence-based practice is really important. And so a lot of your research talks about the components of evidence-based instruction to support reading comprehension. You talk about the role of knowledge, of content literacy instruction, vocabulary, and inference, and strategy, integrated strategy instruction. So can you break down each of those components? Let's start with knowledge specifically. What are those components, I think, that really support instruction?
So we've moved, there's been this debate lately, I'd say in the last maybe 8 years, 10 years, about strategies versus knowledge, right? I don't see these as a dichotomy at all. Like, I think that an integrated approach is what we're seeing is our best route for having change or making change for kids. And so there've been a couple of maybe 3 right now meta-analyses come out lately about integrated literacy and content. And we do see that we're getting, decent effects, large effects for things like vocabulary, comprehension, and content knowledge by integrating strategy instruction and content knowledge.
Interesting. I like that a lot. And I think that a lot of the people that I've had, the experts I've had on Read, talk about this integration. And it's funny because I think it is, if I'm pretty sure that if we were to look at transcripts, integration would come up a dozen times in each podcast, because I think it's something that really holds a lot of weight, especially as we approach instructional practices and the ones that do hold up, especially in the meta-analysis. So in speaking about these three components, is there a difference between the time and the emphasis between how we like elementary versus middle school students, or our meta-analysis?
And this is where I think we don't have as much research as we need. Oh, sorry.
No, keep going. Yeah, this is great. No, I like this. Yeah.
So for, overdevelopment, like vocabulary and content knowledge are going to be important no matter what age, we're working with, through adulthood, because these are what we call unconstrained skills, whereas some skills are constrained, like phonics instruction, for instance. That's a constrained skill. We're going to get to a point where we're, at accuracy, hopefully, and, hopefully we'll get them more fluent as well. But there is, a point where you're going to max out on how quickly you can read, for instance. So we consider that a constrained skill. But vocabulary and knowledge are unconstrained skills that are going to always be important, and they need to be a focus of instruction throughout. And I would say throughout learning, even into adulthood. So even with my students, we're still working on vocabulary and certainly knowledge. But what we do with those students may change over time. And I'm not, sure at what point is, and if we're thinking about integration of strategy and knowledge, then, thinking about those younger kids, getting those basic reading strategies, really get them metacognitively engaged in text and being able to self-regulate in text. And things like main idea, inference strategies, those are things that can be helpful across content. And they need the practice with that to become engaged readers. Especially kids who struggle, because I don't know if, the kids that I've worked with, that the whole point of reading is just to get finished, just to get through it as quickly as possible without cognitively engaging in the text. And so those strategies can be a vehicle to get them engaged. And I think that's important when they're younger. And then as we start moving into, where we start to see that switch from learning to read to reading to learn, around third, fourth grade, we need to start with those disciplinary strategies. So how do experts in a particular area, how do they deal with text? And that text needs to be, as we know, it's going to be increasingly difficult as students get older. So we've got to be working in those disciplinary strategies and adding to that across development. Now, how much and how we do that, we don't have work to help us with that. Sharon Vaughn's group has done some great work in middle school with PACT and following kids for a couple of years. That's probably the closest I can think of where we've actually followed to see. But we haven't really followed, from like K3 into 5-8 to see what works best and how much we should be doing with strategy instruction, because we do want to focus on that content more and more, because those things should be coming natural. Those inference and things, if you're getting enough knowledge, and then those things should be made almost automatically once you have enough knowledge. However, there is research to indicate that for kids who have specific comprehension deficits, that activation may not be natural even when they have the requisite knowledge to work with. So, so if they're not able to if they're not able to activate that knowledge and integrate it, then that has to be taught explicitly for those students. So those students may be different than our typically developing kids when we're thinking about how long strategy instruction, when what to focus on. They may need something different.
Ooh, that just lit up a light. Like, there's so many times where I'm just have to pause and savor what you just said. I want to go back to that point. I'm debating, as a host, you're like, I want to ask about students with specific reading difficulties later and focus on evidence-based practice for all students. I mean, I think too, you know, oh, let me just pause. I like to refer to the Brene Brown sacred pause. And in fact, I like to keep this in because it's so interesting. I'm going to follow what you just talked about. Okay. So you said for students with specific reading comprehension difficulties or just students with specific reading difficulties at large, they may need this more explicit instruction and activation to integrate the knowledge and the strategies.
That's right.
Why? Yeah,
Oh,
let's
go ahead.
focus on that. Why is that? How do we do that? I have so many thoughts. So tell me more about this.
Okay. So, and I'll tell you, I'll start off with a great study that Marsha Barnes did. And this was, she taught the kids about a made up world called GAN.
Mm-hmm.
And, there were all these, I think the lake was made of orange juice. So the kids had to learn all of these facts. So they learned them up to, they all knew the facts and could tell you all the facts about GAN. And then she asked inferential questions. And the kids who had specific reading comprehension difficulties still struggled with answering those inferential questions, even with all the knowledge. And this was replicated and extended by Kate Kane in later. And they found pretty much the same thing, though they also showed that it was difficult for those students to actually learn the knowledge as well. So they're kind of at a double, problem that they have trouble getting up to speed with the requisite knowledge they need. But then even past that, they have trouble with this activation and then integration with the text. So I think, and that's what led me to doing work in inferencing. Because inferencing is exactly that, right? It's the ability to figure out, okay, I need to activate knowledge. I need to find clues in the text, for instance. And then I need to use my knowledge and apply it to those clues to figure out what's going on in this text. So that's kind of what led me to inferencing, because I think it is the heart of comprehension. So if there are two areas, one is inference and then knowledge. And I think of vocabulary as being a part of knowledge. So I've kind of grouped them in this. So if you can teach them to activate, if they have the knowledge and you can teach them to activate it and integrate that knowledge, I think that's really useful. I've run two studies. One was published with middle schoolers. And we had a group, these were kids who had comprehension difficulties. And we see in 10 hours of instruction, we were able to get a moderate effect size on a standardized reading comprehension measure, which is really difficult to do. So just getting them learning, teaching them how to activate that knowledge was important. And then I did the same study with typically developing fifth graders. And I had a knowledge group. I had a business as usual comparison. I had a knowledge group, and then I had an inference group. And we taught them to activate. And we were teaching them the knowledge and the inferencing in one group. The other group just got the knowledge. And what we found was that both groups were the same at the end. So knowledge was on some of, it wasn't statistically significant, but the knowledge group was beating on the inference group on some outcomes. So what it tells me is that these kids probably need different things. And so I'm hoping that my next study will be actually combining these and having the two groups together to see, do kids with specific comprehension difficulties need something really qualitatively different than, or at least at a different level? Maybe the typical kids already got this when they were younger and they were able to practice it and do fine. But the kids with specific comprehension deficits needed a lot more of that, of teaching them how to activate that knowledge and integrate it.
That resonates so much. As you know, I used to teach at the Windward School, and a lot of the things that we talk about are this integration between inference, strategy instruction, and activation of knowledge. And so when you talk about these things, there's so much that I'm remembering of my feet being in the classroom in room 313 at Windward Manhattan and really teaching these things. And so I know that it takes a lot of professional development and training and practice to continue to develop some of these skills and these strategies and practices. But can you provide a couple of insights from your work, particularly in the research studies and providing professional development to teachers on how do we teach, or maybe we could go on for hours of this. So maybe just one example of how we could teach activation, content activation, or and inference at the same time. Well, not even at the same time, but let's break them down.
Okay. So and then I think for those inference strategies, when I did a meta-analysis on the impact of inference on comprehension outcomes, we saw a number of things that showed up as being important. So just using inferential questions, and I know that seems like a pretty basic suggestion, but what we see in the observational studies and textbook studies that have been done is that about 50% of questions are inferential, but that teachers are giving in classes, but there's no instruction to teachers on how to get students to answer those questions. So just in increasing, but we did notice that just by practicing answering inferential questions, students do get better at inferencing. And so we've got to do better at actually giving them strategy, just like me saying, well, just read it again. Like that was my strategy. And I also know working in special education that often I would, we'd read the passage because this was what comprehension instruction was, which is really embarrassing now, but I would read the passage and then we go through the questions. And I would first go through all the who, what, the very literal questions at the beginning. And then there'd be like 2. There's usually 5 questions. The last 2 are inferential. Well, we get to those inferential questions and I just give them the answer. Like I try to scaffold and I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I just give them the answer because I, think they can't do it. But we do know that students can be taught. When we did this meta-analysis and we broke down the differences for students with reading difficulties and those who didn't have reading difficulties, we see a huge effect for students who have reading difficulties. Everybody does better if you teach inferencing on inference and on general comprehension, but students with reading difficulties do a lot better. They get a very large effect from that. So we can teach it. And one of the things that people did was just give more inferential questions. Another piece that was a number of studies did was to use text clues. Kids aren't aware that when an author repeats information, that's important. So they have to be explicitly taught that, using self-questioning, stopping in the text and asking yourself, well, why is this happening? Why is the author writing this right now? Like having that kind of perspective taking of the author can be really helpful. But that self-questioning, why is this happening? Why is this written like this is important. Let's see, just teaching, especially younger kids and probably kids who have reading comprehension difficulties, they don't understand often that they're supposed to bring their background knowledge to the text. Like that has to be explicitly explained and taught. So there were a number of strategies or studies. Hansen and Pearson is one of them, for instance, in which they teach this weaving of here's the text here, and let's find the clues. But now you have to bring. So what's your knowledge you're bringing to this? I really like studies that have used comic strips and jokes.
Yeah,
those are great because they are predicated on the idea that there's missing information, right? That you must fill in. And so kids love that, but teaching them explicitly what's happening, that, oh, here's the knowledge in this comic, right? Or here's the literal information. And then for this to be funny, what did you have to pull out of your brain? And then they realize, oh, that's not in there. I had to use, often our inferences are so automatic. We don't even know that we're doing it. Right. But allowing them to see that process and then apply it to the text they're reading has been shown to be useful. And then teaching character perspectives is another piece. So teaching them, how to infer feelings and motives of characters will help them then, figure out what's going to happen, predict what's going to happen, and become more engaged. For me, not only is this about activation and integration, but it's also about engagements, having a vehicle to be engaged. Because if you don't know those clues are showing up, why would you continue reading? Like if you didn't know they were important and that you needed to be actively engaged to figure out something, it wouldn't be of much interest to continue reading, right?
Yeah.
So teaching those things explicitly can be useful for kids.
I have so many notes right now. It's really exciting. Some of it I can understand, some of it I can't, but I will definitely go back and probably email you. Wait, what did you say here? But I love how you brought all of those different skills and strategies in. One of the things that stuck out to me is when we're teaching comprehension, it's this building this awareness, this self-awareness, this metacognition of how students are reading, why they're reading, what do they do in order to understand what they're reading. And there's this transfer here. And when you talked about the constraints and the unconstrained skills, right? I think that what hit me with that was the strategy that's in a lot of these skills, that they continue as students go from elementary school to middle school and beyond. I mean, we still use it as independent readers, right? And so I really like how you brought that in from teaching inferencing skills to comprehension monitoring. When you talked about text clues, right? Is that one facet of understanding text complexity, or is that part of it as well?
I think so, because it's going to be more difficult as text becomes more complex. It's more difficult to pull out those things. So you could be a person or a child that was doing just fine when the text is not really difficult. Right. But as soon as we start to add that language complexity to it, now it becomes more difficult to pull out what's important in that text and to understand it, because you're not going to be able to highlight what's important if you're bogged down in not being able to understand that complex text. And all of us get there. So, if you read any medical journal, for instance, and it's really interesting. So I will read the meta-analyses, right? And so I'm reading, and it becomes very clear that I have knowledge of what they're doing, right? And the vocabulary is a problem. So I can go look up words, right? And I'm looking up different words. But what I know from actually text clues, words like however, or like, or similar to, and that alerts me as a reader that I have no clue how that vocabulary, this part of the sentence and this vocabulary connects to another piece. And that's where knowledge is. So it's a really interesting, I think everyone should, be in text that they're unfamiliar or and that's complex, that in an area, because then you can really metacognitively go, this, I know that, and it's because I don't understand maybe a function of an enzyme. And I'm like, okay, that's basic knowledge that I don't have here. But understanding that, then I come back to, I think I'm better now in understanding where kids struggle, because, but I would definitely highly recommend get yourself in text that, is difficult, and you'll start to realize where all the breakdown is. But I do see that text clues, if it's in a bunch of language, it's going to be very difficult to discern that that's the important piece when you're bogged down with that language. And that's the other part of this, is that text gets increasingly difficult over time, and getting kids practicing with that text, but also giving them strategies to understand that text is crucial, especially for those with reading difficulties.
Yeah. I love how you flesh that out. Yeah, I was even thinking with text complexity, how powerful it is to teach text structure, right? And when you talked about clue words, I was thinking about, I tutor in addition to some of my work with the Institute, and one of the things we've been working on are debates, right? And we recently taught a class at the Institute about argumentative writing, but you can look at an article, right, that's a debate, and there are key features in debates, right, that would indicate it being an argumentative piece, or that extend across a lot of different types of text structures, from descriptive and enumerative to compare and contrast and problem solution. And when you become savvy, when you become much more as a critical reader, right, you can start to understand where those pieces are in the text that would indicate text structure or a certain way that the article is organized, right?
That's right. You've reduced the cognitive load by giving someone an expert framework to work from. Because experts do this stuff naturally, right? And so we need to make that clear to someone that's a novice, and we can move them closer to that expertise. It also allows you to have something to hang your hat on. So new knowledge can come in easier if I have a framework to place it in. But there also is this piece is then working through a complex text. I know that these features will be here in this type of text. Now I just have to find those. Yeah. And so I think that that's really important. I'm really interested in analogical reasoning and processing because of this, taking an expert framework and applying it across different texts. I think that's what we do naturally. Once we're an expert in an area, we do that naturally, but novices don't know that.
Right.
So teaching that explicitly can be very powerful.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I have two thoughts, but I'm going to stick with the one that comes to my mind first. And I talk out loud all the time on the podcast about my thinking. But when you were at the Reading League conference in October, one of the things that was the most surprising for me is you talked about building and activating background knowledge, but that you don't have to spend a lot of time building it outside of the text, right? You can let the text and help you to facilitate background knowledge building. And in fact, you could be using a variety of texts to do that. So that was really surprising to me, and one that I talk about a lot with colleagues. And so can you talk a little bit more about that?
We don't have clear research to say that this is, well, I will say maybe we will have research in a bit. This current comprehension meta-analysis that we're working on, one of the less effective, it's still effective, but it's not as effective as the other strategies were our preparatory strategies. So, this building knowledge before we begin reading. And I think that it is absolutely important. We know that just having the, knowledge of a title, for instance, will activate knowledge, and it's important. The question is how much, and I don't have an answer specifically because it probably has to do with how complex the text is and where you are on that novice expert scale for engaging with that text. Right. So if we're just going to activate knowledge, it's probably better to keep it shorter. We still want to activate it, but we don't want to totally give all of the answers, all of the things that make us read in the first place. We read to learn, right? Because we're curious. Well, if you do all of that before you come to a text and the kid already knows everything before they come to the text, then why would they engage with that text? And they need to engage deeply.
Right. Right.
It doesn't mean all reading should be struggle, right? Not all. But when we're really dealing with complex text and learning, we want them to struggle a bit with that text. Well, if you give them all the answers before they come to the text, then there isn't any discovery, and it's reducing the amount of engagement. And I'd love to see more work done of how much, and under what conditions, because I do think it's an interaction between what the reader knows and where they are on that novice expert scale to say how much of that should be done.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. I love that. There's one thought I wanted to say, and then I wanted to get into comprehension breakdowns. Through all of the practices that we've talked about, you've infused, or you've talked a little bit about explicit instruction, right? I mean, obviously it's the theme that's coming in, but we've explicitly said explicit a few times throughout this talk. And the one thing I'm thinking about is explicit instruction model, Archer, or even if you bring in David Pearson's work on gradual release model. The one thing I think that some teachers may have a misunderstanding that is explicit instruction is we're staying in explicit instruction. The goal is the gradual model of release to build independence. And so when you're talking about this skill transfer, or you said reducing the cognitive load by providing this expert framework, that is the gradual release model to build these skills for these students so that they can become independent learners and monitoring their comprehension to extract and construct. So I had to just say that because that was a aha moment for me. All right. So now comprehension breakdowns. You spoke about the RAND, you've spoken about all of these, the Dr. Kim's framework, the DEAR framework. And so when you look at breakdowns, what facets may teachers see in why students have difficulty comprehending?
And, it comes back to, if you look at her DEAR model, those domain general skills are going to be important. Executive function, your attention, your ability to self-regulate, like working memory, those are going to be important. And so practicing and giving students who need them supports in each of those areas can be very useful. And so we've got that. And I'll tell you how I kind of think about this, or there was a great book by Carlisle and Rice, and I think you can still get it. I have a couple of copies. And they really break down, because we can have all of these, there could be multiple places where a student struggles because of that. So we've got that. And then we have the language skills on top of that. So we're not even at the language skills, we're at the cognitive piece. And then on top of that, we've got these language pieces as well. And I think they did a really nice job of thinking about, well, I've got a group of students in front of me. They could all have different reasons why they struggle with comprehension, whether it's specific language issues, whether it's these cognitive skills. So what do I do? And they provided a framework, and we call the framework Poems Plus Vocabulary. That's not what they called it, but we needed a little acronym. So the P stands for preparatory strategies. So that's going to support kids that have difficulty with background knowledge, right? Because they don't have that. We need to activate it for all kids, but maybe some kids need a little bit more. Talking back to my students at the school where they were self-contained, I had a number of students who had never been to a restaurant with a menu. And so when we were going to go on a field trip, I thought, oh, this will be great. We'll just go out for a restaurant. And one girl in particular was very upset, and she became, I could see the anxiety. And so once we talked it out, I realized, she said, I don't know how to read a menu. I don't know how to do this. So like going through that, so that's where you go, okay, so preparatory strategies for these types of students would, you probably need to even extend a little bit. Right. But then we have strategies like organizational strategies. These are going to support working memory, right? Kids who have trouble holding and integrating information across a long text, they need the organization to help them. They need to be keeping track of what's going on. So in my interventions, I always, depending on what text we're using and I'm always doing a narrative and expository text together. Yes. That's just the thing that I think works really well. And different kids are motivated by different kinds of text. So we have both of those. And we will have a framework for the kids, no matter which. If we're in narrative text, we're going to have story structure. So the characters at the beginning, so they can write the character down, draw a picture so that that's clear, because too many characters at once is very difficult for a lot of kids. Right. So that organization helps them. And then seeing the story structure, the plot, how it develops, and, all that activate the plot sequence, and we can see where, we have resolution. That's really important for them to see that framework every time. And then in the expository text, depending on what kind of text we're in, if we're working, for instance, in a science text that's very taxonomical, we're going to have a graphic organizer that has that laid out, so that as they're learning information, they're putting it in the graphic organizer so that they can see the structure of that knowledge and how it's structured. And what we hope is over time that you wouldn't need that structure, but it's clear to you what that expert framework is for that knowledge set. Right. And that you'd be able to use that over time. But this is going to help kids, like I said, it supports their working memory. And then we have elaborative strategies, which really get at that deeper understanding, those inferential strategies, those kids that have trouble activating that knowledge. Metacognitive strategies, where they're thinking about their own thinking. So that will be the other. So what you can imagine, when I actually develop a multi-component strategy, instruction, intervention, I'm looking at each of these pieces. That doesn't mean I'm actively teaching a strategy for each of these, but they are embedded in my plans across the days that we're working on this topic area. And then the last one, so poems, the S is summarizing, because we do know that summarizing and, main idea has been shown to be very effective in the literature across both narrative and expository text. So that's part of that. And the V is vocabulary. So that's poems plus V. You kind of get, here are the problems that kids could be having. And here's a way, if you embed this in your instruction, if your whole group instruction, even small group instruction, this should cover some of those areas that kids are going to struggle with.
That is so good. That is so good. Like, I have so many aha moments from this. Like, again, putting myself into room 313 and at the Windward School. And I know there's so many teachers that will say, oh my gosh, like, I love that framework: poems, preparatory strategies, organizational strategies, elaborative strategies, metacognitive strategies, summarizing, and of course, vocabulary. Vocabulary needs its own. We love vocabulary. Oh, that's so good.
Its own category.
I know. We might need a second episode just to break down poems. If you'd like to come back, maybe we'll do a holiday or a post New Year episode,
Fun.
I know. Last question for you. And I know I don't want to end this Thanksgiving tea party on time, or, to people, it's like, oh, you're ending it early, but to you and I, we're ending this on time, because I want to be, very mindful of your time. But do you have any closing thoughts for us, your hopes, or anything that you want to call for your work or the research community on how we continue to disseminate practices like the ones you just spoke about?
Right. Because we need to get this into teachers' hands.
Yeah.
I am hopeful. We just, I told you about the comprehension meta-analysis. It looks like by every decade, the effect size for interventions has gone down over time. So we start off, pretty high, and then we're, about at a 0.3 to 0.4 in the last 10 years. And I wonder, is that because teachers are doing the work now that we have seen? We always focus kind of on the negative, what's not happening. I know that's where I tend to go, but I really feel like the business as usual controls have gotten stronger. It's the way I interpret that data. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that it's definitely one interpretation of that. So I'm hopeful that, and when I talk to teachers, it does feel like they've got the basic strategy pieces down. Mm-hmm. And I think moving next is where we're getting into the more language pieces.
Yes.
I think that text complexity and language pieces, along with understanding the interaction between kids, text, and the tasks we're asking them to do. Like, I think that's the next piece that we're going. Like, what are those individual differences, but how do they interact with different types of instruction and on different outcomes? So I think we're going to get to the point where we're really looking at more of these interactions in our research. And I think we need to really also work with assessment. We've got to do a better job in getting good assessments that teachers can use, that are, easy to use, and we can identify where those issues are fairly quickly to get that instruction to the right kids at the right time. So those are some of the areas that I think are upcoming, people are interested in, and what we need to make a difference, I think, for educators in the classroom.
Amy, Dr. Elleman, this was incredible. I'm so happy we did this around the holidays, because think about thankfulness and gratitude. I'm so grateful for the work that you are doing, for taking your time with me amongst the pie and amongst all the work and grants and research and, analysis and professional development that you're doing, and family time. Thank you so, so much for being on the Read podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been great. It was wonderful talking to you.
So wonderful. I'm so energized. And for all of our readers out there, this is our last episode of 2023. So we look forward to investigating all of the facets of comprehension and reading and child development in 2024. You can read all of our bookmarks from this episode at readpodcast.org or by visiting thewindwardschool.org/The Windward Institute. And we will also have this episode on YouTube, as well as any favorite podcast platform that you so choose to visit during this holiday season. And that is it. And you know what, Dr. Elleman, after every episode, we say until next time, readers. So would you like the honors of closing out and saying until next time, readers?
Until next time, readers.